I'm going to talk about career and family, and they are twin goals, and what I want to impress upon you today is that they're in greater conflict today than ever before. Much of what I'm going to say has to do with data that comes from the U.S., but it's applicable to many other countries, and we can discuss that, just how applicable it is or inapplicable. So there's always been a conflict between careers and kids for women, okay? Not so much men, but very much for women. But it has more meaning and more potency today because there are more women who are college graduates. More of these college graduates are planning very serious careers. And in addition, and perhaps the most surprising part is, in the U.S., and this is where there may be some differences, more of the career-oriented group are planning to have kids and are having kids, and I'll show you some data about that. So how can women with families achieve career, be remunerated fairly, and get the promotions they deserve? So the issue in the U.S. Has attracted a lot of attention in various ways. As I think most of you know, the U.S. is, compared with only one other country that is so tiny, I forget which one it is, in having the smallest amount of parental leave paid and protected. So, so the issue has received a lot of attention in the U.S., and oddly enough, it's received attention from the administration that I shall not name. And even the daughter of the person in the administration I shall not name has raised the issue of expanding protected leave policy and having paid leave. Exactly how she's going to pay for this leave, whether it's personal leave or whatever, nobody knows. But let's say that that does happen. So the question is, are the various ways in which countries, the U.S., has been going about trying to ensure that women have career and family, and there are many, many different ways that we can go through. For example, there's a movement in the U.S. to create greater pay transparency, to educate women to be better competitors in the labor market. But are these going to work? So, so many believe that the twin goals of career and family can be furthered through various fixes. And there are policies that fix women by making them better at bargaining, by making them more competitive, okay, getting them to sharpen their nails, I have no idea. Allowing them to see other people's salaries, the notion of pay transparency. There are policies that exist to fix infants, those troublemakers, by expanding protected leave, possibly paid family leave. And there are policies that fix daddies, and whenever I look at this picture, I think this guy's already been fixed, by changing social norms through incentivized paternity leave. And there are policies that attempt to fix managers by making them less biased, implicitly or explicitly. But these policies address, as this picture shows, the low-hanging fruit. Now, it's perfectly fine. All of us should think like economists. If there's low-hanging fruit, it means that the marginal cost is low, so even if the marginal benefit is low, take it. So, but the problem is that it's not going to do a lot to advance women's ability to combine career and family. That's what I'm going to tell you about. And that's because we're not going to be able to do it unless the costs of temporal flexibility are reduced. So let's think about, what do I mean by temporal flexibility? What do I mean by the costs? And what is the evidence? So by temporal flexibility, I mean an amenity that allows employees to work particular hours and not get penalized, or to work fewer days per week or fewer hours per day. So sometimes temporal flexibility is thought as part-time work, but it isn't part-time work. Because a lot of people who have flexible jobs are working many hours a week, but they're working particular hours, or they're not on call, or they're working hours that are known hours. So there are many, many different aspects of what we mean by temporal flexibility. But the point that I want to make is that the cost of this to firms is really critical. If the amenity is expensive, then the costs are going to be imposed on those who take it in terms of lower earnings and fewer promotions. Those policies that mandate flexibility probably won't benefit workers. Let me give you a very simple example. I like this example because it removes it entirely from what I'm talking about. So let's say that there are two groups of people, some who don't mind particulate matter in the air when they work, and some who will work well only if the air is really clean. So the ones who want cleaner air are going to work for companies that provide cleaner air, and the ones who don't want cleaner air can work for any company. Well, if it costs a lot to clean the air, then the ones who work for the clean air firms are going to have lower wages because it's an amenity, just as if you work in a place that has beautiful furniture or carpets or it has clean bathrooms or whatever. There are certain amenities that individuals who work there are going to implicitly pay for. Well, if the division is between if men in particular don't mind the dirty air and women really can't work with the dirty air, then you can see that wages are going to be different even if they're equally productive. So it's an amenity. But just because, you know, if I mandate something about the amenity, it's not going to change the fact that it's going to cost something to produce the amenity. And so the best thing, if in this example, is if people invest in clean air technology and reduce the costs, and that's going to work. So I've raised a rather difficult problem for which there's no simple solution. But the landscape, I want to point out, isn't really that bleak. And perhaps by looking at where it isn't bleak, we'll learn something. So some firms and some occupations have succeeded in reducing the cost of temporal flexibility. And many are in today's growth sectors. We'll see that a lot of them are in tech, in science, and in health. So what are some of the ways that this has happened? And by the way, the ones that I didn't mention are the ones in the corporate sector and in the financial and the legal sectors. So those are the ones that don't seem to be working hard at reducing these costs. So how have these been changed? Well, improving the ability of workers to be better puzzle pieces for each other, the degree to which you can find a really good substitute for yourself means that you can trade off. And it means that working particular hours isn't going to harm you as much because you can find someone else to do it. Using IT, information technology, to pass information from one employee to another with little loss in fidelity is also very important here and is one reason why in certain sectors there's been improvement. In addition, creating effective teams of substitutes is really good. Teams of complements is really bad. If you're working at a firm and the firm says, you're in a team of 10 people and you all have to get together on Thursday at 11 o'clock, that's a real problem if your kid happens to get sick at 10 o'clock. Also, remunerating by outputs rather than inputs is also a good way. Now, all of these changes reduce the cost of the amenity and thus create pay that, if we think about it, is more linear with respect to hours. The cheaper is the amenity, the more linear pay is by time worked. What do I mean by that? Well, if someone who works 60 hours a week gets more than 2 times per hour what someone who works 30 hours a week, that's nonlinear. So it says that the firm somehow believes that having someone work more hours gives them a lot more, and people are not good puzzle pieces for each other. Information isn't being transferred with little loss in fidelity. It means that people who work more hours are worth more, not totally, but per hour. It's not just the fact that they're working more hours, it's the fact it has something to do with the nonlinearity in the production relationship in the firm. So how do we know that temporal flexibility matters to whether women can achieve career? So I'm going to give you a little bit of evidence. The first evidence is the following. So this axis over here is just age. This axis over here is converted here into the ratio of female to male earnings. This is just in logs, but I converted it into the actual ratio. And this is for each of the cohorts. So first of all, the gender earnings gap, it's important to just go back to some basics. The gender earnings gap greatly increases with age. It also increases with marital status and with family status, which is what's going on under here. Therefore, whatever is leading to lower earnings for women has to concern, or probably concerns, I mean, this is like first order obvious, the impact of family. Now, it's also the case that the gender earnings gap differs by occupation and differs by occupational grouping. Adjusted for various characteristics such as hours of work, gender earnings differences are strongly related to occupational characteristics that I will show you actually concern temporal flexibility, such as whether the firm says face time is important, on-call hours are important, and there are lots of time demands, a whole host of them. So my interest is in occupations that mainly hire college graduates, since those are the ones for which careers are the most important. And what I'm going to do is show you data that use an income cutoff that will include most college graduates. So the income cutoff here is in US dollars, it's $60,000 a year. Okay, so that according to the billboard I saw in the airport yesterday, that would be 60,000 euros, although I realize that that's the sell rate, not the buy rate, but that's okay. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I use the US data, the big data set, which we used to call the census, which we now call the American Community Survey. I merge it across lots of years to get very, very large samples in the millions. And I create 2 groups of occupations. One group is business and finance and law. And I also include health occupations that have high self-employment. In the US, that would be various doctors, podiatrists, dentists. And the second group is people in science, people in technology. And when I say people in, I mean their occupation is in. Because technology firms hire a lot of managers and a lot of salespeople. That isn't what I'm including here. These are engineers and computer science people. So the second group, and I'm going to call them the triangles. The first group are the squares. And that isn't a description of what they are, just the symbol I'm using. So, the second group is science, technology, plus health with low self-employment. And that's a lot of the technicians. So I'm going to populate this graph with symbols for these various occupations. And this graph is sort of a weird graph because it only has this axis. This axis here is meaningless. I'm just going to rank them. So, so first I'm going to put down the business and finance occupations and law, which are the squares, and the health with high self-employment. And I'm graphing them in ascending order of the ratio of female to male annual adjusted earnings. So that all it means is that here, these are the ones with very large gender gaps, low ratios, and these are the ones with smaller gender gaps, high ratios. And so note that, that the calculation that I'm using only uses full-time, full-year workers who are 25 to 64 years old, and it holds a lot of confounding factors constant. Now I'm going to add the triangles. That, remember, those are the science, technology, and health with low self-employment. And here they are, once again, ordered in terms of from the greatest gaps to the lowest gaps. So astoundingly, only 6 business and finance occupations out of the 30-something that I've drawn here have a gender earnings ratio that exceeds the lowest in science and technology. That's these people over here. So you can see that pretty clearly the finance and corporate ones have much, much larger gaps than this other group. And the mean differences are quite large. Weighted by those in the occupations, the average business and finance occupation has a ratio of about 0.79, whereas the average in science and technology has a ratio of about 0.9. So why do these gender gaps vary? I mean, this is a finding that not that many people had thought about, that if, you know, we usually think of some aggregate, but looking at the occupations suddenly should open our eyes to something. Why is it the case? What's so different about these two groups of occupations? So the answer is going to largely concern their temporal demands. So to explore this, I use characteristics from the Department of Labor. The United States Department of Labor has a website called ONET, and ONET stands for Occupational Information Network. And perhaps some of you have seen it and been there. You can find out tons of things about each occupation, hundreds and hundreds of details. So if you want to know how many times a professor has to lift 75 pounds a day, you will find it there. It's a very small number. So what I did in looking at ONET is I picked 5 characteristics that measure what I'm looking for: time pressure, contact with others, establishing and maintaining interpersonal relationships, frequency of decision-making, and whether it is a highly structured workplace. That these seem to me to be characteristics that could have something to do with, so I'm looking for characteristics that have to do with temporal flexibility, not thinking about the occupations, and now let's see what they say about the occupations. So for each of the occupations, you can, just one of the nice things about this website is that the occupations in ONET greatly exceed the number in the American Community Survey. It's about twice the number. And the reason is that there'd be an occupation in the census, but ONET would feel that it was really 2 separate occupations because there's an occupation in one industry or another industry where the characteristics are somewhat different. So you can map it and pretty well from one to the other. So what I do is I map all these occupations into ONET, and I take the number for these characteristics, and then I normalize just 0 mean, 1 standard deviation, these 5 characteristics, and I simply sum them to form an aggregate measure. So a higher value, remember, means more time demands, more pressure, more meetings, more whatever. And a lower value means less of that. So higher value, more time demands, less predictable hours, greater personal contact, and so on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them on this graph here. And what I want you to notice here is that this axis here is the mean, mean for each of the occupations of that summed value that I just talked about. And so the mean here of that sum value would be 0, and it has a standard deviation of 1. So the first thing I do is I just put in the triangles here. And so you can see that it looks interesting that there's even variation within the triangles, within the occupations in science, health with low self-employment, and tech. But notice as well, so you can see that the ONET characteristics look negatively correlated, but it's even more extreme when you put in the squares. So most of the squares, this I should have mentioned that the vertical axis is the gender earnings gap, and that is the same as what I had before over here. So it's the same gender earnings gap here. I'm just taking these squares and these triangles and I'm just rearranging them. Okay. Well, the relationship is a pretty strong relationship. I'm not saying it's causal because I don't have anything to say that it's causal, but it looks like there's something there. A 1 standard deviation increase in these time demands is related to about a 5.4 percentage point lower gender earnings ratio. So what does that imply? Well, the ONET mean in science and technology occupations is about 1 standard deviation below that in the business and the finance occupations. The difference in the ratio, I said before, 0.79, 0.9, that's 0.11. So it means that if the relationship were causal, changing the business and finance group to be more like the science and technology group would reduce the difference in pay ratios by about 1/2. It's non-trivial. So that leads me to sort of the last part of the second to the last part of what I want to say, which is what then can alter characteristics? And let me answer it by way of example. And I'm going to use one for which the characteristics were rather exogenously altered. And I'm going to use an occupation that I've become quite fond of recently, and that is pharmacists, okay? Now, pharmacists in the US is the 8th highest paying occupation for men in terms of median annual earnings. That's pretty high. That's out of 500 occupations. And for women, it's the 3rd highest. And that's among full-time, full-year workers. Most women, female pharmacists, do not work full-time. I shouldn't say most, but a lot don't. Plus, female pharmacists earn more than 90% what male pharmacists earn on an hourly basis, okay? Things are looking good for them. But women didn't always do that well in pharmacy in the US. The ratio of female to male median annual earnings was actually 0.66 in 1970, and in 2010, it's 0.92. So it leads us to a question: what accounts for the increase in relative pay for women pharmacists, and what accounts for this low gender earnings gap today? So pharmacists today who work more hours earn more in a completely linear fashion. You work an hour more, you get an hour more in pay. There's virtually no part-time penalty. So if you're CVS, that's one of our pharmacists, or Walgreens, or whatever, whichever ones you know about, if someone says, oh, I'm a pharmacist, I'll work 80 hours a week, that's very different from going to Goldman Sachs and saying, by the way, I'll work 80 hours a week. It means nothing. So pharmacists are perfect puzzle pieces for each other. Information is transferred from one to the other with sort of perfect fidelity. So how did this come about, you might ask? It didn't exist in 1970, and now it does exist. It turns out that three somewhat unrelated reasons are at the core of what I see as a rather egalitarian profession. So more standardized drugs, more effective use of information technology vastly increase the substitutability of pharmacists for each other. Increased corporate ownership vastly reduced the fraction of pharmacists earning rents from being the residual claimant. You own something, you had better be there at 2 in the morning when the place is on fire, okay? But if the corporation owns it, whereas, I don't know if you know this movie, in the US we had this hilarious movie called School of Rock with Jack Black, and Jack Black would say, the man, right? Someone here knows the movie. If the man owns it, it's good, okay? So examples of other occupations that have successfully reduced the costs of substituting across employees by creating teams of independent professionals include such high-ranking professions as anesthesiologists, obstetricians, discount stockbrokers, some in the banking and real estate sectors, but not a lot. There are also cases of occupations and institutions created to reduce the time demands of professionals. Two interesting cases are veterinarians and hospitalists. So veterinarians, over time, gained flexibility with the advent of regional animal hospitals. No longer does a veterinarian in almost any place in the US have to get up at 2 in the morning to take care of Muffy. Okay, it's the generic name for a cat or a dog. There are regional animal hospitals where you take Muffy, just as if you got hurt, you wouldn't call up your primary care physician and say, come help me, you'd go into an emergency room. There's a recent specialty in the US called hospitalist. I don't know if it exists in Italy. And that has vastly reduced the cost of flexibility for primary care physicians. When you're in a hospital, it's a hospitalist who arranges your care. Your primary care physician doesn't have to bounce around from hospital to hospital. Okay. So I began by noting that we care more than ever about the issue of career and family. Let me tell you a little bit about why. The reason is simple. The fraction of the entire female population for whom career and family would seem important is at an all-time high. That's how I began my talk. For the fraction of women graduating from college is at an all-time high in the US. The fraction of those with career ambitions is, and the fraction of those who will have a first birth is. So let me bring you through this and conclude so I can get your opinions about this. So first of all, there are more college graduate women today. And so this over here is the year of birth. Always remember that. Add 22 or so. This is the fraction of a birth cohort in the US with a BA. I'm very generous. I give people up until age 35 to get a BA. And the green line looks like this. It looks weird because this is this crazy thing that America did. It got involved in Vietnam and it gave deferments to people to stay in college. And this is the line for women. And as you can see, the fraction who've graduated college by age 35 is now 38%, and it's going to go up to about 45% pretty soon. Second of all, more college graduate women have career ambitions, so now this axis is the contemporaneous year. Currently, 24% of women recently awarded a BA, and 29% of men recently awarded a BA have, and recent means 4 years before, that's how I'm constructing it, have successfully pursued one of the highest advanced professional degrees. And finally, here I'll give you this to you in 2 parts. College graduate women are marrying later than ever. This is a worldwide phenomenon, and are having their children later. So the median age of first marriage, here this is the woman's birth, again, not contemporaneous. This is the median age at first marriage. So the median age at first marriage for those born in the 1940s, let's say 1948, was about 23. These are college graduate women, so it's pretty clear what they were doing in college. And by the cohort born in 1955, so this is getting into the pill generation, this is an increase in the age of first marriage that's pretty extreme. And the median now exceeds around 27, which of course is not that high relative to lots of other countries which have seen the same. So later marriage means later births. And that's good for women because they have a chance to invest in their career. But later births have also meant that a large fraction of college graduate women have had no births by the time they've reached their 40s. So this is a short series. I'll show you the longer one in a moment. This is the year of women's birth. And so the fraction without births actually reached a peak here. So this is the fraction with no births of all college graduate women. These aren't women who went to a selective BA school. This is all of them in the US, and there are a lot of non-selective schools in the US. So you can see that it reached a peak of about 27% by the mid to late 1950s cohorts over here. So this is the peak. But that fact was widely publicized. A lot of interesting demographic work was done on this, but it hasn't been fully recognized that there was really a quick turnaround. And the strategy of achieving career and then family was not working. And in consequence, the fraction not having any children by 40 to 44 years old has now plummeted to levels that we haven't seen since the end of the baby boom in the US. So thus, a greater fraction of US women and women in many other countries want career and family. So let me end with a few words about how we arrived at this point. So I don't have time to go through the long history of career and family among college graduate women, but I'll just give you the last 100 years to chew on. So college graduate women in the US and elsewhere, I think, initially aspired to attain family or career because the constraints were that it was going to be very hard to do both. And very few in this cohort did. So this is a cohort graduating in the years before World War, in the years just as World War I was ending. In fact, what we'll see in a moment is that 50% of this group never had a first birth. We then moved to a transition generation graduating from the end of World War I to the end of World War II that had job and then family. We then shifted in the US, and the US is quite extreme in this regard, to a baby boom generation, the mothers of the baby boom, who put, even for college graduate women, who put family first and then had a job. And then we moved to the generation that graduated from the late 1960s to the beginning of around 1980, who said, no, I want a career, and having a family is so easy. Look at how easy it was for this previous generation. I'll just put off family and have career. And we just saw that they weren't very successful at having family. And now we move to this generation that's saying, no, we want both. And just so that you can see the full 100 years, so this is what I gave you before over here. This is year of women's birth. This is the fraction at each age that hasn't had a first birth. So you can see that the group that marries late doesn't have a lot of kids by their late 20s, but they sort of make it up. And I smooth out these wrinkles here, and I put in my divisions here. And you can see that these divisions, we can talk about this later, make a tremendous amount of sense in terms of the career or family, job then family, family then job, career then family, and career and family. So let me conclude. So women have sought career and family in large numbers ever since we just saw the 1970s in the US. And the most recent cohort of college graduate women who desire career and family is the largest group ever. The success rates of their predecessors in achieving career and family when young have been rather disappointing. And only by reducing the cost of temporal flexibility can gender gaps in earnings and in occupations be substantially narrowed, and can the twin goals of family and career be achievable by a larger fraction of women. And the most important point here is and men too, that reducing the cost of temporal flexibility then in many ways improves the lives of both. So collision lessened and perhaps confluence achieved. So thanks very much.